Alright, we've reached the end of the chapter. Now in this video, we'll have a look at generated mapping for image textures. We've already done some work here, but I want to be sure that we've covered it in detail and that it's easy to find for future reference. Alright, we'll need the images from our previous image zip file for this chapter, so be sure before you go forward to have those located for this exercise. As well, I've created a scene I named GenMap for this video, but I haven't included it in the assets. That's because at this point creating this scene to follow along should be pretty easy for you. It's got a cube, a plane, a sphere, which I've applied smoothing to, and a cylinder with an edge split modifier left as is, and also with smoothing applied to it. Alright, if you've got that set up, let's move forward. I'll select my cube, and in the Material tab, I'll press the Add New Material button. I'll name my material Cubestone. Alright, while that material is still selected, I'll go to my Texture tab, and I'll also create a new texture. I'll go ahead and name that just Stone, I guess. I'll make sure my type is Image or Movie, and then I'll navigate down and click Open. I'll navigate to my Texture folder, and I'll grab the texture Sandstone and open it up. Alright, we can see the sandstone texture applied in our Preview button, so I'll go ahead and hit F12 to render. The texture applies perfectly to the top of the cube, but it's streaking down the sides. This is because of the default generated mapping. In Blender, generated mapping means that Blender will create or generate mapping coordinates for textures that are based on the type of projection that's chosen. Well, our default is flat, so Blender is looking at the cube from the top down, giving the sides no space in the mapping, which creates that streaking effect. We need to change the projection type to cube so that Blender can generate correctly. Now, if we render again, our texture is now applied properly. Blender has basically taken each of the 6 sides of the cube and stacked them on top of each other in 2D so that each side is the same. Now we'll explore that more when we get into doing our own UV maps. Now let's go back to our 3D scene and select our plane object. We'll go to the Material tab and create a new material. I'll call this one Brick Plane. Exciting, isn't it? Alright, with that selected, I'll go to my Texture tab and create a new texture called Brick. I'll make sure Image or Movie is selected, and I'll open my browser. I'll navigate to my brick texture, select that, and open the file. Lastly, I'll scroll down and I'll make sure that my mapping is on Generated. As it defaults to flat, that will be fine. I'll go ahead and hit F12 to render. The bricks project perfectly, but we have an opportunity to look at an important concept. I'll hit F11 to return to my 3D scene. With my plane selected, I'll hit R for rotate, Y for the axis, and then 90 enter to turn the plane up 90 degrees. I'll go ahead and hit F12 to render again. Now, even though the plane has been rotated, the map still projects correctly. And even though I discussed earlier Blender looking down at the projection on the cube, it's because of how projection mapping works. We'll get into that subject much more deeply down the road. But the texture is projected onto the object's face normals. The face normal is basically which way Blender perceives a polygon to be facing, rather than based on the polygon's position in 3D space. You can think of it like holding a photo in your hand. No matter how you move the photo around, it has a front and a back, and the picture on it moves with you. Okay, let's grab our sphere. We'll again go to our Material tab and create a new material. I'll call it World Sphere. We'll also go to the Texture tab, and I'll create a new texture. I'll call the texture World. You can kind of begin to see a method here. Let's make sure our type is image or movie, and then go ahead and open our browser. I'll once again navigate to my folder and choose my texture called Earth. And once again, I'll make sure my coordinate is set to generated, but this time I'll leave my projection on flat. And then let's go ahead and hit F12 to render. Well, we can see the texture renders from the top down relatively well, but it begins to streak along the sphere's curves. That's because we've chosen a bad projection for Blender to calculate from, and it just tried to do the best that it could. Let's go back and then change the projection to sphere and render again. Our texture now wraps correctly around the sphere. Alright, let's hit F11 and go back to our viewport, and this time select the cylinder object. Once again, we'll go to the Material tab and create our new material. This one I will call Checker Tube. Bet you can't guess what kind of texture we're going to use. And again, I'll go to my Texture tab, and I'll create a new texture called, surprisingly enough, Checkers. I'll make sure image or movie is selected as my type. I'll once again open my browser and navigate to my checker texture, and I'll open that. I'll go down to my mapping, make sure I'm on generated, and I'll select tube. Alright, let's do a render. I'll hit F12, and our checker pattern renders around our tube correctly, but it isn't rendering on the top like we want. To fix this, I'm going to use multiple materials on my cylinder. Let's see how that works. I'll click Select on my Materials icon and go back to the material for this object. Now I'll return to my viewport and I'll tab into Edit mode. I'll hit A to deselect the vertices and Control Tab to select Face mode. Then I'll go ahead and select the top face. Now, back in the Material panel, I'll select the plus button on the right to create a new material slot, which is not the same as a new material, but we need a slot to put our material in. I'll then click on the New button and add a new second material to this object. I'll name the material Tube Top. Alright, making sure that the face is selected and that the tube top material is still selected, I'll click the Assign button, thereby assigning the material to this one face. Now, since this is a new material, I'm not constrained by the checker material on the rest of the cylinder. I'll add a diffuse color such as red, but I could just as easily add another image as a texture. If I were to do that, I would want to go back over to my Texture tab and make sure that the mapping projection would be generated and flat, because it's a single face and by itself, flat would be the best projection to match it. But we've used a diffuse color, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit F12 to render. And we can see that the red diffuse color is applied to just the top face, and that the checkered pattern is applied to our sides. Alright, that should have you up and running with our generated mapping pretty well. That'll conclude this chapter, and I'll see you guys next time around.